I think we can go ahead and get started here. Really excited to welcome everyone to this webinar on empowering managers and employees with transparent equity data. I am Alex. I am your moderator today. I lead community and partnerships here at ChartHop, and just really excited to cover this topic. I think equity is one of those things that is a really tricky thing to educate employees about, to understand how to interpret the data and put it into practice. But it's also a really important and critical part of compensation. And we have Carta here today, which is the leader in understanding and interpreting equity data. Personally, Carta's resources have been how I've learned more about how to think about equity. And so we're just really excited to have Carta and ChartHop here joining forces to kind of talk about this tricky topic. So today we have Peter Walker with us. He's the head of insights at Carta. Going to be sharing a little bit about some of the data Carta has around how equity is talked about at companies. And then we have our VP of product, Justin Garrity, here from ChartHop. So how this is going to go today is we're going to have them both introduce Carta and ChartHop, talk a little bit more about how we're working together. Then we'll jump into a quick presentation from Peter talking about just some of the trends in equity that we're seeing before we jump into a Q&A session. We'd encourage all of you to be lively in the chat, share what's resonating and start some conversations. We'd also like to encourage you to use the question and answer chat as well, because we are going to have some time at the end for audience questions. So really excited to jump into it. And without further ado, I will pass it on to Peter to introduce Carta.
Hey everyone, super happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So if you're not familiar with Carta, we are an equity management platform, but we do quite a lot more than that as well. So you probably first encountered Carta when your company issued you stock options, and you can exercise those through the platform, understand where you sit in your vesting schedule, all sorts of things around equity. And we do that for over 36,000 startups now across the US and then across the world. So you can also do a lot of interesting stuff if you're a founder on running valuations like 409A, getting liquidity on our secondary marketplace, and then also learning what to compensate your new employees with Carta Total Comp. So kind of a full suite solution for helping founders grow their companies. And again, happy to be here this morning.
Thanks, Peter. Justin, would you like to introduce ChartHop?
Yeah, glad to. Hi, I'm Justin Garrity, run product here at ChartHop. If some of you are not familiar with ChartHop, ChartHop is a dynamic people's operations platform that connects and visualizes your people data. What that means is we essentially bring together all of your people data and your recruiting data into one platform. And it works very much like a dynamic app. ChartHop essentially is this very dynamic app. Once you have the people data at the heart of ChartHop, you then have these different views to visualize that information, whether it's in an org chart, which all of us are familiar with, but at ChartHop, we take it to the next level. Not only is the org chart visualizing all of your departments and management structure, but it also allows you to visualize data on top of that. So you can take any dimension that you've essentially added to ChartHop and visualize that data directly on the org chart. Org chart also works as a way to navigate. So you can find somebody in the org chart, click on them, and then view their profile and get connected with their information in a very handy way. We also have people analytics, so a very robust analytics and charting platform where you can create dashboards, custom graphs, all with the people data you've put into ChartHop, but also with any data that you've added since then. So as you supplement all your people data around your employees and around your organization, those all become options to visualize and chart within the platform. And we also have a data sheet. When we work with a lot of HR professionals, the spreadsheet is like the most favorite format to almost get any kind of work done or kind of look at data. So we have our version of a spreadsheet called a data sheet. We take spreadsheets to the next level by having the data already available in the spreadsheet format. So rather than copying and pasting and put it in there, you can just work in these data sheets directly in ChartHop. and do some very dynamic modeling and scenarios with those. As I mentioned before, the employee profile, as you can get to from the org chart and other parts of the application, gives you a very robust and detailed look at different employees with the kind of information that you want to surface in your organization. So it could be something very broad and general about how to contact them or their working style, but something very specific that maybe relates to your organization in terms of skills or things that they bring to the table. And then one of our favorite views too is the map, where you can geographically locate your organization, especially in a remote environment, which many of us are in now, or hybrid, understanding where people are at. It also updates dynamically so that as people move or kind of are attending a function in a certain city and they update that, people can understand that they're now in that location. So very handy to coordinate meetups and events with employees. And then we have our operational side of our platform. So once you have all that data in, you visualize that data, you can then operationalize or do a lot of your operational workflows within ChartHop, whether it's headcount planning, modeling out different ways that you want to set up your organization, or even just hiring plans and things like that. Comp reviews, recruiter experience, so making sure that you can kind of see your recruiter information come in through ChartHop. Performance reviews across the organization, and surveys and feedback. And all of this kind of gives a big picture of what ChartHop is, how it works dynamically as an application. But then in that employee profile and the data sheet, we also bring in equity data. So whether that's for the employee themselves, or from, if your organization enables that, you can also have a manager or leadership look at equity data for your employees. And that'll go into the next screen here, which will show how that comes together. So we're very excited to talk about the partnership that we have with Carta. Carta, as Peter described, is a leading equity management platform. And we know that one of the big values of being part of an organization as an employee is not only understanding your compensation from a salary perspective or bonus or things like that, but also with equity, how much the organization is enabling you to invest in its future. And so by partnering with Carta, we're able to bring in data that Carta manages directly into ChartHop. When an employee looks at their own profile, they can see that data appear there. And we all know that when you get the offer letter or some of those like kind of onboarding elements is when you kind of maybe first look at that equity data. And then maybe you lose track of where did it go? How do I get that? But by putting this right into the employee profile, where any employee can look up that data within ChartHop, we're able to essentially not only show what the estimated value of the equity is, but also allow you to model based on some visualizations and dynamic elements if the organization were to be valued higher or things change in terms of that valuation, that you can kind of see the impact that it might have on your own value in terms of your total compensation. So we're just so thrilled to work with Carta. We also know that there's a lot more that Carta offers beyond ChartHop. So it's very easy for employees, once they get into this view, to then click on and link over to the Carta app and get even more detailed information there. So very excited about our partnership, and hopefully that gives you a good overview of how we at ChartHop have integrated Carta information directly into our platform.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Justin. Yeah, we're really excited about this partnership, but for the rest of the session, we kind of want to take a step back and talk about some of the bigger underlying issues with equity data and how it's communicated across the org. So like I mentioned, we're going to start talking about some equity trends with Peter, and then launch into a discussion from there with time for Q&A at the end. So Peter, I will turn it over to you to chat about some of the interesting data that you have from your survey results at Carta.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alex. And just echo Justin here, super excited to be working with the ChartHop team. I think the overall mission of making sure that employees understand and can dig into questions around their equity is one that obviously we firmly believe in. So this is awesome. This survey results that we're going to go through touch on a number of different subjects, but the overriding theme is, what do employees know about their equity and what do they wish they knew? So first and foremost, one of the biggest questions that we get around equity is, how am I going to be taxed on this equity if and when it becomes realized value? So As you can see from this chart, we asked a bunch of 1 through 5 questions, 1 being strongly disagree with the statement, 5 being strongly agree with the statement. And the statement, I know how to reduce the tax liability related to my equity, we kind of wish everyone knew was a 4 or a 5 there, but the vast majority of employees are actually a 1 or a 2. There seems to be a lot of confusion around what the tax implications related to their equity might be, and they're not quite getting what they need from their organizations to make the right financial decisions. So hopefully that spurs a lot of discussion around some of the free resources that Carta has or across the web. And that leads really neatly into the next one, which is I know how to determine the best time to exercise or sell my options. So if we take a step back, the vast majority of you, if you're startup employees, you probably received an ISO, an incentive stock option, when you joined your company, and that will vest over a period of time. And then you have to make this choice. You have to make the choice about whether or not to exercise that right to purchase the stock. And that exercise choice is really difficult. It can take into a whole host of factors. And it seems as though the timing within that exercise, should I wait? Should I do it immediately when it vests? That's something that employees have a ton of questions on. So obviously that's something that we hope that companies will do a better job educating in the future. If we jump to the next one, part of what we see within the data around exercise rates is that employees are frequently not exercising them. This chart only goes through the end of 2022, and in the beginning of 2023, that purple line just kind of continues to decline back towards about 35%. And what that means is really, if you flip it a little bit, 65% of employees are choosing not to exercise their stock options. And they can be doing that for really good reasons. You don't want to outlay the cash. There's reasons why you might not want to exercise the stock, but fundamentally, it does create this disconnect because the equity that you were given as an employee was supposed to be this giant advantage, this comparative advantage to joining a startup in the first place. You're building ownership within this company as you build the company itself. And so when they're not exercised, that kind of leaves that portion of your compensation off the table, which is a real shame. And one of the reasons why this exercise rate might be declining is it has to do with when an employee is allowed to exercise that stock. So first, it must vest, meaning you typically wait about 1 year to get 25% of your stock, and then it might vest every month or every quarter after that. But then, as we've seen, sadly, a lot of people are either being laid off or choosing to leave their jobs lately, and that is a pressure point. Because at that moment, you typically only have 90 days to make the decision as to whether or not you're going to exercise your stock. Or your stock options, I should say. So a lot of exercise behavior happens in that 90-day period. So it's a very acute decision. So it's good if you're an employee on this call, just know that you may in the future have to face this 90-day crunch period. And if you go ahead and get ahead of that 90-day crunch, either by choosing to exercise early or choosing consciously to not exercise, then essentially you've made that decision over time, and it won't feel like such a pressure point when you end up leaving the company and have to decide at that point whether or not you want to outlay cash for these stock options. And the last one is a pretty general one. We might actually have one more chart, but does a company that you're working for provide equity education? Only 37% of respondents said yes to this question. So obviously that's a big deal at Carta, that we want to get equity education to the hands of all startup employees. If you believe that ownership is important and equity is important, then obviously understanding equity is equally important. So hopefully you work in a company that's part of that 37% purple band, but probably a lot of you work for the 60% or so of companies that are not providing equity education today. Just to follow on, obviously employees would love that their companies help them understand equity. Now, there are some reasons why companies choose not to do this. First and foremost, a company executive, especially like a legal counsel or things, cannot by law provide legal or tax help directly to employees. They don't want to be involved in that personal financial decision. Over and above that legal requirement, though, I think we can all agree that companies can be doing more to educate their employees around their equity, especially at the points and time which an employee is thinking about that equity, specifically on the onboarding and offer stage, and then also as they approach 1 year and that equity first vests, typically after a 1-year cliff.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, Peter. A lot of really, really great data there, and I'm sure we had some attendees taking screenshots of the slides as we went down. And yes, we will be sharing these slides afterwards, as well as the recording from this presentation. Awesome. Next, so we're going to jump into a discussion with Justin and Peter here. We've prompted a few questions here, but again, would love for you to kind of submit your own, whether it's off of this discussion that we're about to have, or from any of the data that Peter just presented. Would love to hear your questions. So I think first off, it's a follow-up from what you were just talking about here, Peter, is companies often don't want to provide too much guidance when it comes to equity, as it's an investment and a company can't promise specific results. What are some positive ways companies can help their employees understand their equity better and be more comfortable with the probabilities?
So I agree with the overall sentiment that companies can get a little wary about providing too much information, or they don't want to feel like they're promising the employees a specific outcome. Because as we all know, equity is not the same thing as cash. There's a lot of startups that will end up going under, and there's a lot of startups that will make it big, and it's impossible to tell which startup is going to be which. I do think that one of the ways that companies can help in a little bit more of a positive fashion with equity transparency is one, love the idea of enabling it alongside the other parts of compensation. Oftentimes equity is thought of as this kind of like little black box over to the side, and it doesn't get talked about with things like 401k benefits or bonus structures and things like that. So wrapping that all into one view where you can say, this is what in total I'm receiving from my employer in terms of benefits. I think that's a really useful way to start. And obviously ChartHop is a great way to do that. The other thing is that equity is not something that an employee is going to be thinking about every single day. So I think it's useful to take advantage of the moments in which an employee is already going to be considering equity and using those as education points rather than just information transmission. So the three key ones that I would expect would be one, around the offer and onboarding, and having their recruiters and other people be really educated on what equity really means and be able to answer all those questions as you're coming onto a company. Two would be at that 1 year cliff, which is typically when people kind of look up and say, oh, wow, that equity's become real. I vested some shares. How exciting. And then the third one is if there is any liquidity points, either on the secondary markets through tender offers and the like, or through bigger transactions up to and including, an IPO. So using those moments as a way to kind of insert equity education is something that we've found really helpful.
Awesome. I love that.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just going to say, love the moment structure there, because I think that's a really great point that like employees are not thinking about this all the time, but it's important to have that information at their fingertips at those kind of key moments when they are. Yeah, Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I really listening to what Peter was saying, like early in my career, I know when I was joining startups and didn't have a lot of experience, it was a very frustrating experience to have questions about equity and then just feeling like the companies were being very avoiding certain questions or not saying certain things, and you kind of felt like you were on your own, as if you weren't part of the discussion that was happening at the executive level. Only later in my career did I realize that the executives are the ones with the experience of going through this a few times. So it's not that they're having meetings where they're talking about it, they just know what this event is like and they've been through those. So working with Carta has been amazing because, initially we looked at Carta as a management platform for your equity, but the more we've gotten to know the Carta team and Peter and the work that they do and just understanding the value that they provide, is the amount of resources and education that they provide is just astonishing. Like, you can be at any stage at your company with a certain type of equity grant or in a certain situation and find materials on Carta that can speak to that. And I think that's just so helpful. I think for us at ChartHop with our platform and our customers, we want to make sure that employees see that equity data alongside other information, just like, their performance reviews and the rest of their compensation. So that it's not necessarily something you're talking about every single day, but it's also not something that's hidden or in a corner or something you have to remember to go look at. So just having that handy comes in or available really comes into practice when you're having maybe a manager review, when it's maybe around time for compensation reviews or updates or a yearly review. Like, you can have a conversation about the equity and what that means. And so I think just that combination of having it visible and then knowing that there are resources out there that if you find your company is not giving you the information that you'd like from them, understanding that there's legal reasons why, that there are these resources like Carta that provide a ton of information to help you navigate that.
And Justin, just to piggyback on what you said, one of the things that I found when I was starting my career in startups was that there was a little bit of this imposter syndrome feeling like, I bet
Yeah.
everyone else sort of gets this complicated equity thing and I just need to go educate myself and I'll do that on my own. And then you kind of never get around to doing it. I want to be the first to tell you, there are a ton of equity questions that we get from employees at Carta. So like even the people who are most steeped in this information, we're still asking a ton of questions because it's a complicated subject and there's a lot of in and outs. So asking questions is definitely the way to go. And I can assure you that you are not the only employee in your company who probably doesn't quite understand what this tax thing is for that type of stock or that one for this. It's kind of all over the place. So feel free to ask questions to both your company leadership and then of course to Carta or whoever is managing your equity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And even, thinking beyond like some of the basic questions, like there's just like so many different fringe scenarios that can happen that you kind of would need to work through. And like, no one is like a pure expert on their own. So I think like, it's really important to like, I guess, normalize the fact that this is, a confusing thing for everybody to understand. And I think along those lines, one of the things that we've seen, especially in tech and startups in the past few years, is we've had a lot more people come into the industry from other spaces. And usually you get a lot of education if you go through an IPO or an exit event, right? Like you actually get to see, you go from this like concept of something to like actually seeing what it looks like in practice, having to like understand the tax implications, all of those sorts of things. But newer employees who either haven't experienced that or folks coming into the industry who just like, don't have a background in like, what these things are from a startup. It's just something that gets mentioned. How can we best help them understand the risks and probabilities of what may or may not happen?
Yeah, so it's obviously there's a ton of variables that go into this conversation. I think the reason that we've highlighted IPO or acquisition as these pressure points is that it's typically the first time that many employees have an opportunity to realize any liquidity out of their stock options. And liquidity in this sense just means actual value. So taking those stock options, converting them into cash or something else. So unfortunately, the IPO market has been pretty shut over the past year or so for startups. So hoping that comes back roaring strong later this year or in 2024. But there are a lot of startups that are actually considering a strategic acquisition now that perhaps weren't in earlier years. So typically how that works is it will impact an employee in a couple different ways. Speaking from personal experience, I was part of a startup that was acquired when I was at a Series A stage or so. And what happened in that case is that our grants were actually subject to accelerated vesting. So instead of just saying, okay, your startup was purchased, you vested about, say, half your stock options, so you could have access to the cash for half of them. There was actually a provision in our term sheet where we had the accelerated vesting for all employees. That doesn't happen all the time, but it is something that happens fairly commonly in these acquisition scenarios. And then speaking on the IPO side, something to remember as if you're going to be part of an IPO. And again, I can speak from personal experience here. My partner has been a part of at least 2 of them. There's this real sense of excitement within the company about this IPO. It's this amazing moment. We're finally, showing off ourselves to the world, and we get all this liquidity from this event. And then you get to the day of, and you realize, oh, there's a 6-month lockup on those shares. So I was super excited to, realize some cash from day one. But employees that were part of the company while it was private have to wait 6 months typically in order to exit any of their cash or their stock positions. So just know that it may be super exciting on the day of, but then you have to wait a little while before any of those become realized cash value, which can be slightly annoying.
Yeah, I think on that, it's interesting because when you have those modeling calculators, you can you can model throughout that 6 month and see it change quite a bit. And sometimes it can be very exciting. Sometimes it can be like, oh man, and you're just waiting for the next event in the future to get back to some of those amounts.
Right.
But I think one thing I noticed too is when you are part of an acquisition or get acquired by a larger company, that you find yourselves with a lot of peers after that have come into the company through different means, like through different acquisitions, or they were hired there originally and have been an employee for a long time. And you find yourself like coming from an environment where there might have been a very similar pattern in terms of what everyone's equity was, in terms of how they got options, to one where it's very mixed and everyone's got a different story and they've got a different, a way that's set up. And so because a lot of times that information is private, you're not really sharing it, but you're not really looking around and finding people with very similar setups that you have in that situation. You might have a very unique situation based on your role, how the acquisition happened, who your peers now that you're on this new team. Even your manager might have a very different setup than what you have after that event. So that's where like these resources are really helpful, because you might be kind of unique in your situation and how you ended up there.
Awesome. Seeing some questions coming in. Keep them coming. We've got one queued up here for these two, and then we're gonna jump to some of your questions here. Appreciate y'all jumping in. Okay, last question is, how does better visualization help communicate a complex topic like equity value for employees?
Alex, this is my favorite question. I spend most of my day nerding out in various visualization platforms like Tableau and the like. But I think that in the topic specifically of equity value, visualization is one of the key components to making sure that employees understand the potential value, because most employees, when they're joining a startup, particularly early stage startups, are not joining for the present day value of that equity. If they were, they would be making kind of a silly decision because the company's probably not worth that much at the moment. You're always envisioning, hey, what could this become over the next, say, 2, 5, 10 years? And am I joining, that quote unquote rocket ship? So a lot of those step functions, you see the like charts that kind of go up in little waves there. Those are great ways to help the employee envision and imagine what the equity value will be in the future. But it's important that companies use those responsibly. So it was, in certain Carta products, especially like this offer letter product that we have, we allow the company to set different checkpoints to say, hey, if we hit certain performance milestones and our valuation obviously increases, here's what your equity would be worth in that scenario, or here's what it would be worth in this scenario. And I feel like that scenario modeling piece is very important, as opposed to just giving someone one chart and saying, here's what it is, this is set in stone. Because obviously the future is unknowable, and you're going to want to play around with the different outcome metrics for your equity and for your ownership percentage in general. The other way that's important here is, I think that there's a lot of great diagrams on Carta and elsewhere that help you walk through how things are taxed, or how you should think about the exercise and tax implications. Basically, what is it going to cost me in order to own these shares and then sell these shares? And those two pieces, the ownership and the selling, are when either the tax implication comes in or the exercise cost comes in. And seeing those in a flow chart is just so much more immediately helpful than reading them down a long spreadsheet. I know, as I spend all day with data and I still don't love spreadsheets. So I'm sure for people who are not very data focused, that's even more of a headache. So, huge proponent of using visualization to kind of walk you through various scenarios on this side.
Yeah, and I think in ChartHop we have a fairly simple but powerful visualization, which shows you, based on the number of shares that you've been offered and how that vests over time, and then the current value of the company. That's the starting point. But then we give the employees the ability to essentially change that value of what that share might be in the future, higher, hopefully not lower, but you can model different scenarios and see the impact that might have. But not only does it change the total, it shows you over time how that changes. And so time is one of the most important elements that we really invest a lot in at ChartHop in terms of across our platform. In our platform, you can kind of go back in time and see how your organization was organize a year ago, who were the teams and how were they set up, and then what it is today. And so time is something that we think gives you perspective to understand the present day, but also what the future might be. And that's definitely true with equity. I mean, that's all about how time has an impact on that, and how different elements over time might have a change in what that total valuation is. So even though it's simple, it's interactive and it's powerful, and it helps you kind of understand time as a part of that equation. And I think that's where visualization really comes in handy. Otherwise, you just have a number, and numbers are interesting, but seeing them charted over time is really valuable.
And actually, Justin, to your point around time and the advantage of being able to map different scenarios, I actually think this is a really good moment to touch on a question that we got in the chat from Michael, who asked, how are options impacted during a down round, especially if the strike price is below the new preferred share price. So to unpack that a little bit, a down round is when a startup is valued at lower than the valuation was in the prior round. And unfortunately, we have seen a lot of startups have to go through a down round in recent times as things kind of got a little too bubbly in 2021, and they're kind of coming back to more historical norms, or a little bit of a downturn in startups over the last 18 months or so. So it is possible that you'll be in a situation where, okay, I have a strike price, also known as the exercise price. Let's call it 10 cents per share on the options. And now if we were to value that company, the strike price would be below that 10-cent marker. Maybe let's call it 8 cents. So what do companies do if it doesn't make economic sense for me to exercise a share option for 10 cents when it's currently worth 8? That would be kind of a silly financial decision. So there are a lot of ways that companies choose to handle this. Some say that, hey, we're going to grow into a new valuation and you should just hold on to your shares and perhaps not exercise them, but just hold on to them for now. Some companies do what's called a repricing. And that's done by going to the board and saying, we would like to give our employees more upside in their equity. So we're going to voluntarily change their strike price. This can be done by amending current grants or actually issuing new ones. And we're going to give you that 8-cent strike price instead of that 10 cents. So you continue to have upside in the equity in the company future going forward. We've seen a lot more companies take that route. It's still not I wouldn't say it's the majority of companies by any means, but more companies are approaching it that way. And the thinking around this is just, we want to make sure that employees have incentive to stay at this company and grow it with us. And a lot of that incentive comes from the value of their equity. We want to make sure that's fair and just to all the employees, especially those who joined us in the last couple of years. But it all kind of wraps into this bigger topic of, if you're at a company that is very secretive about the equity values and doesn't want to talk a lot about how this impacts your financial decisions, it can be really difficult to get this sort of information, and then you're just kind of left in the dark. So kind of comes back to transparency is the king here. It's a great way, if you have access to ChartHop and others, that's a wonderful way to go look at this yourself. But if you don't, it's never bad to ask these questions and say, hey, if we're really, really secretive about equity values and the like, why is that? Why do we have a culture that doesn't want to talk about what equity could mean for their employees? Because I'm sure that they spoke about it in your onboarding process and during the recruitment. So we should be able to talk about it now, even if things aren't going quite as well.
Anything to add there, Justin? Yeah,
I was just say the whole transparency angle of this is really important. That's one of our core values at ChartHop. It's a value of our company, but it's also a value of our platform. And we want to make sure that we give organizations that use ChartHop all the tools to be as transparent as they feel it fits their culture. So when it goes into the equity side, when an employee goes to their profile and looks at that equity in ChartHop, we have it so that the default is set up at the current valuation based on the last round of investment. So you can see the model based on, if nothing changes, this is what it looks like. And so when you have different rounds, those can be updated by the company to essentially reflect that in that default kind of view. So we hope that helps employees understand, if nothing changes right now, this is what it's at, and to help companies be very transparent about that process. But yeah, it's like, I think it's important when people, especially when they join a startup, it's exciting. There's some education that you need to do if you want to really take advantage of fully of being part of that type of environment. And one thing, I don't know if it was clear in what I've said or what Peter said, but like, even if you're not a Carta customer today, even if your company doesn't use Carta, or they should, but if they don't or you don't, they have a ton of resources on carta.com that you can use, that you don't have to be a member to get access to. They're really helpful resources, and I think they're just doing a lot to kind of help provide the education into the community.
Appreciate that, Justin. We agree, but we would. So
yeah, I mean, but it's separate from this. Like, truly, Carta has best-in-class resources. Like, whenever I've had friends who work at startups ask questions about equity, always sending out Carta resources, like the best out there. And we'll share some of those links at the end here, and then in a follow-up email as well. I did want to touch really quickly. There was an earlier question about can companies extend exercise periods beyond 90 days? Obviously, a 90-day exercise window is kind of like the default norm, just like the 4-year, 1-year cliff vesting schedule. But there has been a trend, at least in the past few years, to extend those exercise windows. I'm kind of putting on the spot a little bit here, Peter, but care to talk any about like what you're seeing in that world?
absolutely. So the exercise windows, what it's called, you may hear this term PTEP, PTEP, which is post-termination exercise period. And this is typically the 90 days that you're given after you leave the company, either by choice or involuntarily through a layoff or the like. And you have those 90 days to decide whether or not you want to exercise the options that have vested. So first, typically the options stop vesting when you leave the company. That's pretty intuitive. And so you're left with this pile of options, and you have to decide what you're going to do with them. Are you going to exercise the right to buy them, or are you going to let them expire? And when they expire, they simply just go back to the company, and you no longer have any access to that value. So the 90-day is 100% the default. I think it's something like 90% or even maybe a little bit higher of grants on Carta have a 90-day window. It is, speaking as Peter here, not necessarily for Carta. It is a personal argument for me, and something that I deeply believe in, that employees should be given more than 90 days to exercise these shares. At Carta, we've actually linked the exercise period to the term of employment. So the longer you stay at Carta, the longer you have to exercise after you leave, which I think is a wonderful way to do it. There's 100 other ways. There are examples like Amplitude, for instance, which is a startup that has a default 10-year exercise window. Now, these do not come at a cost. These do not come, without a cost to the company administration and all that kind of stuff. You may have to have a different type of grant. It would convert from an ISO to an NSO. There are like a lot of, nuanced details here, but it is possible. And one thing that you see from our data, which is interesting, is that as layoffs rise, as it's a period of high layoffs, so we saw this both in April of 2020, and then, of course, over the last 6 months or so, you see that percentage number of grants with longer than 90 days is trickling upward from about 10% to close to 18% now. And the reason that's happening is because founders in this difficult moment go to their boards and they say, I want to be, fair and equitable to these employees. I want to give them longer to exercise their options. So if they can do that during these tough times, it's my contention that you could do that from the very beginning. Obviously, you might talk to founder or legal people who disagree with me a little bit there, but in general, you should expect to have that discussion with your family and your financial advisors for the 90 days after you leave the company.
Awesome. Thanks for that explanation, Peter. So I've got one for you, Justin. We've talked a lot about kind of employee education here. We've talked a little bit about visualization and kind of the impacts of siloing this information outside of other spaces. I'm curious how you think about how other parts of the organization are affected by siloed equity data. I think in particular, can you talk a little bit to how it might impact managers as well and other leaders at the org?
Yeah, one of the options we have, and I think this is important just in general for any company, is whether you have a policy where managers have visibility to their directs equity. Sometimes it's not set up that way for reasons because of when people started and just it's asymmetrical. And sometimes you have a more transparent company where that information is made available. The reason why that's important is because as a manager or as a direct, when you're essentially getting into events like compensation reviews or performance reviews, where there are compensation changes, promotions, things like that, that equity is part of that equation, that it's not left out to the side, it's not invisible, it's not out there, but it's there. It's an element that is in your total compensation, should be a factor when being considered for a change in your compensation or changing your total equity. And so having that visibility is really empowering as a manager, because you can understand where maybe your team is at, or where a certain individual is at, and same thing as an individual when you're talking to your manager. So I think there's just a different style with different companies of whether or not they enable that transparency or not, or empower leaders. But when they do, it can really kind of help and improve those processes around reviews and compensation. I think it's an element where, especially when you're trying to understand how to invest in key members of your team in terms of their future, when that's part of that discussion, it can help improve those events and those opportunities. So
yeah, and on that
Thanks
note,
for, go ahead. Yeah,
there's just, to double down on what Justin said there, I think that a lot of times employees, well, if we take a step back, an employee who stays at a startup for 4 years and goes through their first full initial grant, that's pretty uncommon these days. Typically people are jumping around a little bit. You might not get to the end of your full year grant. So if you are talking about a promotion and you want to really incentivize that employee to look to the long-term future with your company, either adding a refresh grant, adjusting vesting schedules, like using equity as this tool to align incentives, I think is really powerful. So I'm glad that we want to try to bring it into all of these kind of conversations before they actually, look at their equity values and you say, oh, wow, I'm fully vested. Maybe it's time for me to look elsewhere. You want to make sure that they're feeling the love from the organization and making sure that you're building with them.
absolutely. And definitely heard that as a tool, especially, for startups that are kind of, reevaluating their cash position and wanting to, double down and re-incentivize employees, is using equity and kind of bring that to the forefront as a tool to do that. I do actually briefly want to touch and shout out to Michael for feeding us with so many questions in this chat here. Appreciate that. Promise Michael is not a plant here. There was a question here around how to determine how many shares to provide to a particular employee. This is actually interesting. I think we get this probably once every 2 weeks in our community that we run, the People Ops community. Somebody's asking for, like, how do you think about, where to go to benchmark employee options for, X kind of angle and X type of company? Any suggestions, either of how to think about that, or places to go, resources maybe that Carta has as well around that?
Yeah, so when it comes down to the individual number of shares, that is typically done through a calculation about the total outstanding shares, and then like what percentage ownership is the way that you typically think about it. So at Carta, we have a product called Carta Total Compensation, which helps founders decide what to pay in both salary and equity to new hires. We think that's the most comprehensive and real-time benchmark of startup salary and equity data anywhere in the world. So that's definitely a resource if you're a founder. That's a paid product. But when you're thinking about this conceptually, typically when you're a very small startup, so let's call it pre-seed to series B or C, so in that early stage growth time, you're not often going to be discussing with employees the notional value of that equity. You'll probably be more discussing about number of shares and then total percentage ownership of the company. We have released a couple of really interesting deep dives into startup equity Marissa, but maybe we can link those in the chart, the most recent compensation report. And in that, you can download this little PDF and it'll show you, hey, here's what the first 10 hires at a startup might make in terms of equity. I think off the top of my head, I think the median first hire at a startup, so non-founder hire, gets about 1% to 2% of the company. Just to give you a ballpark range of like, that's the first person who joins a company. That's what they should probably expect in terms of equity values. But it's a huge range of like, what role are you in? Technical, non-technical, how much is the company worth? When are you joining? What are you bringing as a new candidate? So I wouldn't want to like speak on how you should exactly decide that. It's kind of a long discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of different context that goes into that. I do want to touch, okay, last question here, kind of before we wrap things up and share across some resources. I think this is a particularly relevant one for this environment. Brian asks, can you talk about common versus preferred shares or options and how investor preference might impact the total value of options, especially in a reduced valuation environment like this? I think that's one of the like most hidden things in this scenario is like, as an employee, like, how do you know, what might have happened during a down round?
Yeah, Brian, that is a deep question. I'll try to give a bit of an overview answer, but please don't fault me here if it doesn't get into the exact specifics that you were looking for. So Brian's question is about common versus preferred shares and how investor preference would impact the value of the common shares if there were to be an exit, perhaps at a lower valuation than people were expecting. So important point to note at the front, typically, and by typically, I mean in the vast majority of cases, preferred and common shares convert 1-to-1, typically. That's how you usually start this math equation. So common shares are issued to founders and employees. Typically, investors get preferred shares of some kind. But as you fundraise, preferred shares are given to investors, and they may have attached these different rights or preference structures. So for instance, it could say that, hey, if this company is acquired for less than the current value, the investors get their money back first before anyone else gets paid out. So if you're acquired, if the investor puts in $10 million and you're acquired for $20 million, it's not like everybody shares that 20 million equally. The investor gets their 10 million back first, and then everybody else shares in the remaining 10 million. As an example, there's a whole host of different other rights that can apply to investor shares. Typically, though, it is good to think as an employee that as your company grows through fundraising rounds, it's likely that your stake will be diluted by new shares that kind of enter the company. So if you own 1% of the company today and you expect to raise another 2 or 3 rounds of financing, it's unlikely that you're going to exit with 1% of the company just based on all the new people that came onto the cap table. So it's good to keep in mind that whatever the value is today of your total percentage ownership, it's likely to go down in the future as your company issues more shares to new investors, new advisors, new employees.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, whenever a company goes through some kind of event like a new round, it's always good as an employee to ask that question. Has this changed the value of my shares, equity in any kind of way, or something I should know about in terms of, how does it impact versus before this event? I think those are really good questions to ask, and usually a pretty good straight answer in terms of what the impact might be.
And again, don't feel silly here. There's a lot of founders who need to ask what the investor preferences are as well, because it's not always easy to tell, who owns what in various scenarios.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, thanks for jumping in to ask questions, and thanks Peter and Justin for answering them on the fly here. Again, Carta's got a lot of resources, and I think one in particular that we want to highlight is Equity 101 from Carta. It's a course actually with 10 interactive lessons that really is just like a great way to dive into understanding the value of equity, so you can be more confident managing it. So would definitely recommend that. I think we're going to drop the link to that in the chat as well. And the follow-up email with the recording will have the link there as well if you missed this, or for those that have dropped off. And want to just thank everybody. That's the end of our time here. Peter, Justin, really appreciated it. Great to have you all here joining us, and looking forward to the future of this partnership together. There also is, we'll send out some more information about the partnership in that follow-up email as well. Discount opportunity available there too, and we'll have some details on that. So thanks again to everybody, and hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
Thanks, y'all.